Yes, indeed. We are ready to roll. Welcome to the Daily Tck Part 2, where again you will have one of the most important political updates from day 2 of the negotiations. Day 1 was obviously a fun-filled, dramatic, energy sapping experience for many of us, where negotiators were brought into a situation where many of them felt unhappy with the current text that we have, asked for textual insertions of text, which basically means that all negotiating parties were then asked
where
to...
negotiators were brought into a situation where many of them felt unhappy with the current text that we have, asked for textual insertions.
Well, you are more than part of it. All right, so we are still live, believe it or not, after all of that nonsense. So, welcome again to day 2 of the Tick Tick Tick. Do we really want to associate a brand considering how we're going?
It doesn't matter.
Probably not.
Get going.
Daily Tck meeting of the Bonn ADP 2.11 negotiations. This is where we give you the daily update of what's been going on in the negotiations. We talk to some of the wonderful partners and young people in the room, and we get some of their ideas about what they want to act on, what they think are the most key critical issues going forward, and what we can all do together to help these negotiations move forward. I'm going to pass now to Christian to give us a political update.
Yes, and I hope that by the time I come to the political details, our special guest for the day has arrived. We were hoping, like at the last session, to have a daily guest for you who would talk us through some of the details that some of these NGO experts understand better than any of us here in the room. But let me take us into things and then hopefully hand over to a guest or to the room later. Yeah, I think as Chris indicated yesterday, everybody got a bit worried, right? So we came into the session with a 20-page text, which was nice in terms of length, but obviously worrying in terms of strength and ambition. That text was sort of a stripped down, bare minimum collection of placeholders in a way. And without much surprise, we saw a whole range of stakeholders be quite worried and upset about it. First and foremost, some of the developing country blocs, including the Africa Group, the G77 bloc, and others. But I think it wasn't just limited to the developing countries. You would have also heard from the Europeans or the Umbrella Group yesterday that some essential elements were either missing or phrased and presented in ways that didn't help them so much. So we went into this yesterday morning, and everybody was wondering what would happen with this, a new agreement by the co-chairs who invited surgical insertions to the text so that it would be a better reflection of what parties cared about. I guess there was a fear that maybe the text would balloon back to 80, 90, 100 pages or something like what we had in Geneva in February, maybe undoing some of the good work that we had seen over the past few months, perhaps becoming even more unmanageable with even more conflicting options that need sorting out. But I think what we got overnight and what we saw this morning was much less scary and threatening than what people thought. Actually, on the contrary, what I heard this morning in the NGO meeting was fairly positive. Perhaps not like a dream text that ticks all our boxes, but first of all, in terms of keeping it manageable, the length is not horrific, 34 pages. I mean, the co-chairs applied a few tricks in that the font is pretty small and the line spacing is pretty narrow. So I don't know, you could probably make this 34-page text easily look like a 48-page text. But still, it's not 100 pages. It's not chaos. And then more importantly than length, and more important than, process also, is the substance, of course. What are the elements in there? And I'm glad that our special guest has arrived and we can hand over in a bit to talk a bit about these elements. But to give you the sense from the room earlier this morning, overall, the different issue experts, who track finance and who track mitigation, etc., were all more on the positive side. I think we heard that a lot of the insertions were about bringing good stuff back in that we want as civil society organizations. Nothing sounded exactly perfect, but on the positive side mostly. I think there's still some things that are actually really missing, and then there's still some things that are phrased and worded in ways that we would like to see stronger or better. But it seems like actually yesterday was a good day after all the panic and all the headlines about country groupings being upset and nervous and things like that. The inserting is not necessarily over. I guess parties can still add things, and maybe they do. As somebody said this morning, we may not be out of the woods yet with this text and the 34 pages. It's also interesting to see what parties will say this morning after seeing this new version. Will they be as sort of moderately pleased as the NGOs were in their meeting this morning? I think that remains to be seen, but there was optimism, I think, around that. Yesterday, there was also an issue about balance, or imbalance rather, in the text. Some groups were very upset, both government groups as well as NGO groups. A hashtag made the rounds on Twitter, labeling it the US text. Talk in media coverage about some kind of conspiracy with the American co-chair, who would have used or abused his role to make this text very sort of spun into the direction of what the United States would want to see. I think this morning in the meeting, I didn't necessarily get a sense that today we would use hashtag G77 text or hashtag Africa text or something. It seems to be sort of fairly balanced, probably because everybody got their thing back in. So maybe this sort of imbalance and distortion in a certain direction has been dealt with to some extent, at least, which would be positive. And then an interesting thing worth mentioning is the headline. So I think so far it was a non-paper. The official negotiating text is still a thing from Geneva, the much longer and probably convoluted and complicated thing. And now what came out overnight or this morning has a headline that suggests this would be, I think, our draft negotiating text, which, if accepted by parties, would be a useful step forward. So this document would have the relevant status. I guess that's most of the important things I wanted to share with you on the bigger picture and the news this morning. Let's see how today goes, but after all the worries yesterday, we might actually be on a rather helpful track. Oh yeah, and maybe a last thing, just picking up on something I explained yesterday, there's the important thing of ownership, right? Parties need to feel buy-in and ownership with this text for it to be a negotiating text, for them all to be happy to move forward with it. And if something like this 20-pager from before this session from the co-chairs is presented, then obviously everybody feels a bit distanced to it initially because it's not their thing and they don't feel that it has sort of their fingerprints. But with this exercise yesterday and what is coming out now, a lot of that should have been mitigated. So people should probably feel that it is their text, and many parties should feel that it is their text. So hopefully that bodes well for the rest of the negotiations this week. I'm sure that Tasneem has thoughts to add to my overarching update here, but it would be really great, I think. And I don't know how Chris wants to play this, maybe I hand over. If we could look a bit at the key elements. So like, what is it with long-term goal, with near-term action? What is it with ratchet mechanism? What is it with adaptation and loss and damage? In this text now, and perhaps generally the dynamics around these, which countries are pushing what? Shall we swap chairs and you do a Q&A?
Sure, sounds like you've got a lot of ideas, but happy to add some of my own. So let's find out who this mystery speaker is. Tasneem, thank you for joining us. Would you like to give a bit of an introduction as to why you are, I guess, reputable speaker for this morning?
Irreputable speaker. No, thanks very much for inviting me again. And I really apologize. I didn't hear about an H2H venue, whatever. People saying it's hydrogen peroxide. Yeah. So I'm sorry I was late. Thanks, Christian. I missed all of you, but you certainly gave a big picture overview. I thought I was supposed to speak about the text, so I should just actually say let's have questions and answers. But I think what I will do now is actually go through the substance.
Yes.
Christian's already spoken about the kind of blow up yesterday. From how many of you have been in this process and attended sessions before? All of you? Who hasn't? Sorry, let me start with that. It was the first time.
Yeah, a bunch of new people.
Great. Didn't you enjoy yesterday?
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, there's never a dull moment in the UNFCCC process. Never a dull moment. So I'm happy that you had your first experience cutting your teeth on a blow up. That's what happens, and it sometimes takes us by surprise, but we shouldn't be surprised. It is reasonably expected in this process, especially since we're coming closer to Paris. The stakes are high. People are going to dig their heels in. This is all part of the negotiation. So good for the blow up, because as Christian said, in fact, when we came into here, we were all pretty worried about the text. Good for the chairs to try and put something together. Great that they had streamlined the text to 20 pages. And exactly as Christian says, it's all very well to have a shorter version, but if it's not a stronger version, then it is problematic. And so thankfully, it wasn't just the NGOs, that's the usual suspects banging on the doors for more ambition or more strength. Parties themselves did that yesterday. And as Christian also indicated, certainly it's not ballooning. People always, get pretty nervous about things like that when parties say we want to reopen things. Certainly, as we stand now, the text hasn't ballooned into a kind of 300-page monster. It's still reasonably manageable. And there is a better sense that parties are starting to co-own, as Christian says, the text itself. They're starting to see the balance appearing, the things that they had submitted before that had not even featured in the chair's text back in there again. So what we have now, we can say, is a stronger basis for a negotiation to happen. There are obviously, some good things in there, some important critical hooks for us, for our priorities as NGOs. And there are some bad things, as there will be, and there might be some middle of the ground things.
So Tasneem, what do you see as some of those good things? Let's jump into those.
Okay, good. So if we're talking about, I'm not going to go through the whole text, but certainly the things that are important for us. The first thing that jumps out is that the long-term goal has been strengthened in some ways, and the language of decarbonization is back in the text.
Great.
For CAN, for example, the long-term goal is, phase out of fossil fuels and phase in of 100% renewables. That's not going to be it's not in the text. But the next best things are there. Options that actually will keep us on a pathway and is consistent with 1.5 degrees. So as I said, there are hooks that we can work with. We won't get our language in there necessarily, but the next best thing is possible. So we'll have to fight for that. So I think the first one is the long-term goal. I'm sure you would have been engaged in the kind of strong advocacy work around human rights being inserted in the text. There's some really good, strong language on human rights. A few options, actually, on human rights, broad clauses on human rights in the text. So that's a good insertion. Then the issue of adaptation and loss and damage. The one good thing about the chair's text was that it actually took into account the views of parties that said there has to be a distinction between adaptation and loss and damage. And the articles did that. So what's happened now is, in fact, the adaptation text has become better. It is still not strong enough on the issue of the adaptation goal. So it's still pretty vague about what that goal would look like. I think we were told by the experts on adaptation and loss and damage that there might be some confusion about the separation of loss and damage and adaptation piece now, but I'm sure parties will do that. And of course, there are those who just don't want loss and damage featured at all. And you'll see that there's an option for no loss and damage at all.
I think that came out of the Canadian insertion of text.
No, I think it was the Swiss and the umbrella, or maybe the Canadians as part. Really, the Canadians? Was that before Harper?
Are you so optimistic now? So just to update everyone, if you haven't heard the news out of Canada, they have a new prime minister. Justin Trudeau came in after 9 years of Stephen Harper's reign and 1 year previously of the Conservative government. My understanding of this from our kind of Canadian partners is that this is the least better option of the possible options in Canada, but it is still a much better option. So that's why Tasneem may be feeling a lot more confident about Canada than she has been in a while.
The hashtag is dream come Trudeau. Go ahead.
Well, so maybe it was Canada, the last kicks of a Canadian Harper. So that's on adaptation, loss and damage. It can be strengthened much more, of course, and people will work for that. I think all of you can highlight those issues. The adaptation goal needs to be strengthened much more. The finance piece has been strengthened quite dramatically, and it was the G77's text that they submitted at the last session that had disappeared completely, managed to find itself back in again. So there's some good pieces in the finance. To a large extent, I think the finance people are excited about that insertion. A lot to work with, can be strengthened here and there, but certainly a very strong basis and definitely a better piece than what was there in the chair's text before. In terms of the ratcheting, the stock-taking piece, still, well, stock-taking is already quite a weak language for what we would want in terms of a review process, a really robust review process or mechanism, and to, in fact, not only be a review, but to be able to scale up ambitions there. And we've been calling for a science and equity-based review to be in the new agreement. So they've called it stock-taking. There's a stock-taking standalone clause, but what's happened now is that in other articles, so under mitigation, I think under adaptation as well, and probably finance, they start linking those things to a stock-taking. So there could be the hooks for building a machine or mechanism in different places, but they'll add up to something. We might not get the full singing and dancing ambition mechanism, but certainly you'll be getting the pieces of it come together. So we'll have to look at how we strengthen that. Certainly that's an area that needs much more strengthening, but at least it's better than what it was before. That stock-taking article in the chair's test was very weak before. So let's take a hard look at that and see how we can strengthen that much more. We would certainly want to see stronger language on this kind of stock-taking based on science. And being in line with whatever long-term goal they come up with, if we hope is the strongest, in line with the 1.5, and equity. Which brings me to the other point. In the chair's text, one of the big issues that the developing countries were really worried about was the issue of equity, and that not being reflected at all in the chair's text. What's happened now is at least there's a balance that's featuring right through the text from the preamble, where they recognize the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, and it's featuring in each element or article. There's something now that talks to a differentiated responsibility, and some all of that building up towards a much more balanced and equitable possibility for this agreement. So that's also exciting. But I'm not going to talk much more. I know there's things on technology that people might be interested, etc. But the pieces that I think would have been important for us generally as the important hooks, that's the developments around that. Let me just end off by saying, I don't know if Christian mentioned it, but now they'll go off into what is called spin-off groups. That's good, because in spin-off groups, they'll start negotiating. And even if they are busy looking at the text and seeing how to manage the duplications and the language, and they have little fights about and arguments about language, that's a negotiation. That's an important part of negotiations. That's where parties find out and work out where they really differ, or whether this is just a issue of we can iron it out through language. So if you're in those spin-off groups, I'm not sure if they're open to the observers, but watch for that. That's important. You need to know what the politics is behind what they're arguing about in terms of the text as well. So I'll end there if there's any questions.
For sure. So that was as you can all tell, a pretty in-depth analysis of the new text that we have. Thank you, Tasneem. I saw from the notes that Tasneem was scrolling, there's a lot of work that went into those summaries. So you definitely got quite a valuable kind of understanding there of what has happened overnight. So, so I hope we have some questions now. If you do have any questions, please raise your hand. And we have, what was your name, sir? Luca. So if you can unmute your Google Hangout. So he's going to come around and just speak into the computer. We are trying to do a situation where we try and support people who aren't able to be here and who want to still be updated with this political update. So if you do have a question, please wait for Luca to come around and speak into the computer. Obviously, my ears still work, and Tasneem still, operates as a fully functional human being, and we can hear you. But it is just great if we can get it through the computer as well. So, who has the first question? Okay, Andreas.
You mentioned this not very strong language on the 5-year cycles or in stock taking. So I wonder which countries now would be the ones who push forward for that, or who would push for that in the process, who would oppose that, and how probable do you think is it that we get a stronger language in that?
Well, look, there's not really, the 5-year cycle isn't missing. It wasn't missing even in the chair's text. It was called communicate on a 5-yearly basis, right? It's weak language. Of course, it must be strengthened. So who would be pushing for 5-year cycles? I'm absolutely certain that the European Union will be. It's one of their issues as well. The COP presidency, I know, is really keen to see the 5-year cycle get pinned down. There are some in the G77 who would be pushing for some blocks in the G77 as a whole. So blocks like ILAC would be pushing for that. I'm almost certain. I actually have to think whether I've seen the Africa group actually, they will support the 5-year cycle, whether they'd be stepping out and being the front runners on pushing for that. But certainly there is a big and growing support for 5-year cycles. I think the parties are starting to recognize that that is probably where they need to land, is my analysis of it. But it does take a lot of advocacy work, and so I think that's where we should be paying attention as well.
What do you think of the concern that some parties have expressed that 5 years is simply too short a cycle to be able to set any ambitious targets, and perhaps, too much of a reporting burden for some of the poorer countries?
So there are two things that can happen. Look, the 5-year cycle, I think Brazil actually put forward a really interesting proposal of a 5-year commitment period and an indicative next 5 years. If you recall, I think in Geneva, or maybe before even. I'm sorry, I've been here so long. So that's an option. You have a 5-year cycle, that's your commitment, but already, and I think that's pretty useful, you already start saying at the beginning of that 5 years what your next commitment would be. So it's called an indicative commitment. So that builds in some certainty and predictability, allows for longer term planning. And when it comes to reporting burdens, this is where we have to look at the differentiated responsibilities based on capability, right? So, for example, we've always been arguing that least developing countries, the small island states, they shouldn't carry huge burdens, reporting burdens, until their capacity is actually built up, or that they get financial support to build up that capacity. So you can have a differentiated approach to reporting, to verification, etc. So I think it's absolutely feasible. It can be done.
All right. Anyone else with another question?
Thank you. You mentioned at the beginning that we may not have seen the end of insertions. And in fact, we heard a few parties yesterday express concern of, will we still be able to bring something up at a later point? And the chairs, I think, very clearly said that, yes, you'll be able to. One of these in particular of interest to us is we didn't get the language we were looking for on particularly intergenerational equity. And I'm wondering what you see as how further insertions will progress and as the text is moved forward, and how will that look different from the big round of insertions we had yesterday?
Well, theoretically, there's always an opportunity for parties to submit a proposal, right? This is a party-driven process. So we could end up in Paris and the party could say, or some parties could say, actually, we want to reopen something. So that's always a possibility. So yes, there will be opportunities to still insert things. If you did not get the language you want on intergenerational equity or anything else, my advice to you is go and lobby parties. Supportive champions for your issue. They are absolutely looking for, they've reached out to civil society to say, help us with text on this and that and the other. You have an opportunity. It's actually a golden opportunity. So go and do the lobbying and try and get that in there, but it's not closed. It's open. So this is the time you do your hard work and go and get your text in there. Whether it will end up in the agreement or not is another matter. But that means you have to continue working hard for it.
Yeah, another question here.
Okay.
Oh.
Hi. Could you please go deep into technology transfer? What are the suggestions that were talked about technology transfer yesterday? And which are the countries that are supporting?
Now I must confess why I'm not the reputable person to come and have this discussion. Technology is the one issue that we actually don't follow. I mean, we get our support back the CAN group. So WWF actually doesn't follow the technology piece very, very closely. So I've not actually looked at it.
But it was also considered.
It was. The feedback we got in the CAN meeting this morning was that they were concerned that technology is still not strong enough. And that there wasn't clarity about the role of the technology mechanism, executive, whatever that thing is called. But we can get that.
Yeah, maybe we can introduce you to our colleague Janice from Sierra Club in the US, who is the lead on this issue, and then take that offline and maybe take another question now. I think we could take.
Sorry about that.
No,
that and capacity building and LULUCF and all those things. Don't ask me questions about those. Sorry.
Yeah. So hi, I'm here. Could you please tell something more about, I don't know if I understood well, this manned conspiracy from the side of US?
I think so the question was in relation to, was there a legitimate conspiracy by Dan and the US in terms of, kidnapping the text before yesterday and presenting the, direct from Pennsylvania, the text that they want to see, or was that just a bit of a media blow up?
Yeah, and who was particularly afraid of this?
Okay.
Should I mute the microphone?
No, look, to be quite honest, I don't get embroiled in those kinds of things, to be quite honest. I mean, there's going to be this is the UNFCCC. You will hear all kinds of accusations and finger pointing, and I've never heard of a legitimate conspiracy. That's fascinating. I would like to actually know more about legitimate conspiracies. So you will get that. Personally, I mean, some parties have actually also, you'd hear, that's the text, we didn't see the developing country text in there because probably, you'll hear that. My suggestion as someone who's been in this process for a very long time and in politics, try and, what is the saying, Christian? The wood for the trees.
Yeah, try not to
get distracted by noise. Just stay focused on when the real fights happen, you'll know. So the conspiracies will go on. You'll hear all kinds. You can make up as anything you want, whisper anything you want. So yes, there are some groups that will say that, some NGOs will make claims, etc. It's their right to do that. Absolutely. As I say, I don't get embroiled in those kinds of things. You have to keep focused in a process like this. Is my advice to people who, if this is your first time, don't get sidetracked. You have an issue here, you want to fight for intergenerational equity, keep focused on that. The politics will happen, and it happens in NGOs, it happens amongst parties, My advice is stay calm, be focused. So I'm not going to comment about everybody's different conspiracy theory about the process. Sorry, it's and organizations have a right to say what they want.
Sure.
That's their analysis. Perfectly okay. But I would suggest for people who are really wanting to be engaged on getting your issues into the new agreement, don't get distracted by all the noise.
And
I'm from Poland, and it was many times some obvious standpoint of Polish government that the climate policy is actually some conspiracy against Polish economy. So that's why I'm interested in this, you know, a little bit funny things. Yeah. Thanks.
I think just on that as well, it's a pretty weak conspiracy if it only lasts for about 30 minutes before they then decide to open up the text for insertions from everyone else in the UNFCCC. So if it was indeed a conspiracy, it was a big waste of time because they then transitioned pretty quickly into allowing everyone to get their options in. And we saw 65 textual insertions overnight. Adopt the Negotiator will be presenting a bit of an infographic to, I guess, display all of those insertions for all of you so you can see all that. And we'll obviously then give you a bit of a better idea of how to compare the options that we currently see compared to the countries that made those insertions, and maybe that'll help with some of your tactics along the way today and perhaps into tomorrow. As Tasni mentioned, there's going to be some pretty important spin-off groups. Hopefully some of those will be open and accessible to all of us. If not, there's definitely a lot of opportunities around coffee carts and croissant, I guess, bins, whereby you can find out some pretty useful information, especially if you have a spare €3.50 where you can buy someone a coffee and in exchange ask for some information. Not that I'm recommending any of that.
And smoking areas.
Yes.
I'm not recommending smoking, but lots of negotiators smoke.
Yeah, smoking.
I'm not encouraging smoking.
Smoking is potentially a habit that you might want to develop leading into Paris. Saying that, let's go for one last question if we have any more questions on the floor. Yeah?
Just a short follow-up question. So from my understanding, when you said you would push for 5-year cycles or on a stronger language on that, actually the EU legislation is based on a 10-year cycle. So all the carbon market stuff and all other things. And I wondered to what extent that undermines credibility or their ability to push forward for that in the negotiations, or if it does.
To push forward for 5-year cycles?
Yeah,
Because of the 10-year legislation. Look, every domestic context is different, right? So also you can talk about 5-year election cycles, for example. So not legislation cycles, but political cycles. I think that the idea of having, that's what I'm saying, you could have a 5-year commitment period with an indicative next, so a 10-year period. One is your commitment period. The next is an indicative signal. Should help with the kinds of certainty around that. So for example, I don't know which country are you from? Germany. So if Germany had a 10-year legislation, is this your legislation cycle or?
No, I think the EU legislation. So not inside Germany, but
the EU
is based on a 10-year commitment or period.
Yeah. But say in Germany, your contribution, for example, to that 10 years is your 5-year commitment, what you'll do in the next 5 years, and the indicative thing you will do in the following 5 years. So it's a 10-year, you could do it that way, certainly. Or you set a 10-year and you extrapolate backward and get a 5-year commitment. We should see how it's workable. 10 years is also too long. 10 years is far too long. If you just understand, you know, when we took the decision in Durban in the COP17, and they said the agreement must come into force in 2020, we would have almost lost more than 10 years then. That's why we're pushing very strongly. Oh, sorry, I didn't mention my own Rottweiler issue. Workstream 2, pre-2020. So, you know, focusing on the new agreement, but there's this other thing called the Workstream 2 decision. Please don't lose focus on that.
So for anyone who's not exactly up to date, Workstream 2 is all about pre-2020 ambition. So making sure that before the Paris action ambition mechanism, or what I'm trying to push for, the Paris ambition package, therefore we can analyze it as a PAP test, what that is going to come into force in 2020, we need to obviously get a lot of things rolling before that time. And that is workstream 2 for anyone who's not up to date.
Especially because the science says emissions needed to peak before 2020. In fact, it needed to peak this year.
Well, luckily, we are definitely going to do that. We have one more question, so we'll just throw that one in.
Yeah.
Pretty, you know, it's of a very low base. There's been some actually really good and exciting work there. So the decision text, of course, it can be strengthened, but at least there's decision text there. Before it was just a talk show for quite a number of years. Now parties are seriously committed to ensuring that there is an outcome for workstream 2. It's going to be mainly process related. All the actions as part of the action agenda will be captured in platforms and things, but it's good that it's there. We'll look at strengthening it, but certainly there's more attention on workstream 2 as well, our parties.
All right, well, that concludes our little abuse of Tasneem's amazing intellect and understanding of the negotiations. I hope you still have energy for the rest of the day, because I know that would have been pretty sapping. But if anyone does want to, I guess, track down Tasneem's amazing understanding throughout the day, where will you be hanging out, Tasneem?
The smoking area. Not to smoke. I lie. I smoke. No, thank you very much, and please, amazing intellect and all of that is a very heavy burden to bear. But can I do a little advert?
You can.
Okay, so you might know that some members of CAN, with some members of the Climate Justice Network, plus the trade unions, etc., have put out a CSO review of INDCs. So tonight we're having an event. We had an event on Saturday. We had a press briefing yesterday. Tonight we're doing a sort of longer presentation of the CSO review and its findings and its recommendations. So you're welcome. It's at 6:30 in that venue where CAN had its meeting this morning. What is that venue? H something. H.
Across the road through the other security, where you have one big room downstairs and one big room upstairs. Whatever it's called.
And for all of those listening online, there is a new website for that CSO
Yes.
Civil Society Review. Do you
Yes.
remember the website, what it's called?
www.civilsocietyReview.
Org. Probably .org. All right. All right, well, thank you so much. Check out www.civilsocietyReview.org. You can also kind of check out all of the INDCs on the UNFCCC submission portal. If you haven't seen them yet, there's definitely some highlights. I recommend looking at Ethiopia, Morocco, some of the other ones that recently came in. Philippines is really interesting as well. Have a look at those. And please, once again, a big round of applause for Tasneem.